And so this series is kind of our why. You know, why are we here? What are we doing? So we know that we're here to bring hope, healing and hope as we live and love and lead like Jesus. This week we're talking about what it means to be like Jesus and to actually love like Jesus. And we're going to talk about two different passages of Scripture today. Luke 4:14 through 30, that you already heard Eli read for us so graciously today. And then at Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. And in Luke chapter 4, Jesus kind of gives his manifesto, and he tells us what his mission statement is. And you saw the way that people reacted to that. You know, when he said, "This is why I'm here," not everybody was in line with that idea. And does anybody remember what they did at the end of that story? Yeah, they drove him out of town. They were going to throw him off a cliff. They wanted to end it before it started, and sometimes that happens. But all Jesus was here was to demonstrate God's great love to a watching world. But it wasn't necessarily received well by everyone. So in Luke 4, verse 14 through 30, where Jesus proclaims his mission is to bring good news to the poor, freedom to the oppressed, we see that actually lived out later in Luke 19 as he does that for a specific individual. And so these passages reveal the heart of Jesus' ministry and encourage us to love like Jesus. And so that's why I want to take some time to look at them today. In that passage that Eli read, we see that Jesus' mission was not about self-promotion or maintaining the status quo, but it was about transformation. And at the heart of the four Gospels, we find the transformative love of Jesus. As John Mark Comer reminds us in Practicing the Way, the gospel is not just about getting people into heaven, but about getting heaven into people. And I think a lot of times when we come to church, we figure as long as we've booked our ticket to heaven, punched our ticket to heaven, we're good to go. But really, that's not the only reason Jesus came. Jesus didn't just come to take us to heaven, or he would have just come and taken us to heaven, right? He came to bring heaven to us, to embody all that heaven is and all that the Father is amongst us so that we could experience it. He didn't merely preach about heaven, he preached about earth. And he taught us how to live on this earth. He preached about change and he embodied it. He lived it. He challenged and changed the way people viewed one another and treated one another. In Luke 4, he declares freedom to the captives in his hometown synagogue. In Luke 19, he transforms the life of a despised tax collector. Now, these two moments call us not only to marvel at Jesus, but also to follow his example by becoming agents of transformation in our own community, even at the risk of being run out of town or thrown off the highest cliff, which fortunately in Beaumont, there's not a lot of super high cliffs to throw you off of. Jesus calls us to transform our community, and he models it. Jesus calls us to see the people that most people overlook and those that most people just simply prefer to ignore. As we look at these two scriptures, I want to just share with you three ideas, really. The first one is this mission of Jesus from Luke 4:14 through 30. I'm just going to read a couple of those verses right now, but in Luke 4, we see Jesus stepping into his public ministry, empowered by the Holy Spirit, as he unrolls the scroll of Isaiah and reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recover of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Now understand, this is why the people wanted to kill him. Because honestly, some of these ideas are pretty radical, aren't they? Really kind of a bold idea. Like I don't know that I've ever heard a political candidate run on the platform that I'm here to set prisoners free, heal the blind, and lift up everybody that's been oppressed. I don't know that most communities are going to vote that guy into office, especially like for sheriff or for the judge or even for mayor. Nevertheless, senator, president, that's not going to play well at the polls. And it didn't in Jesus' day either. It was actually a very bold declaration of purpose, stating that his mission is to bring hope to the marginalized, healing to the broken, and liberation to the oppressed. And so really it's no wonder that his message was met with resistance, because it challenged the comfort and tradition. So what do we do with this? Like, how do we apply something like that to our situation? Well, just as Jesus proclaimed freedom to the captives, we're called to bring hope to the oppressed in our own community. So who are the captives in our world today? They might be the incarcerated. They might be the homeless. They might be the single parent struggling to make ends meet, or the lonely elder in a nursing home. So what are we doing to serve them? Mark Moore, in his book Quest 52, writes this: "The true test of our faith is how we treat the people who can do nothing for us in return." So let's reflect on how we can live out Jesus' mission in our own hood, in our own neighborhoods, with our own people and our own family. Last year I put up pictures. This year I didn't take pictures, so I can't put them up. But maybe you remember a little over a year ago when I put up pictures of the sweatshop that Mary runs out of the church. For those of you that aren't in on that, she has there's a group of our ladies that get together and they pool their resources and they buy things to help the homeless. And before Christmas, they bag all of those up. And this year, how many bags did you make? 160 bags to take to the homeless. Now understand, this is separate from all those gifts that we brought to give to kids that had already been distributed. And how many gifts were distributed this year down at some other place? 2,700 gifts that you guys helped, and you contributed to that, made that happen for the kids. That's an amazing thing, right? But this was for these homeless people that really don't have a place and don't have a family and don't have kids. And knowing that our week of winter was coming, it had things like hats and gloves and things to kind of keep them warm enough for the week. Unfortunately, though, for some reason, they didn't show up to get their gifts this year. Like our ladies took them down to some other place, and there was just kind of a scheduling conflict or something, like, right? Like,
On Monday, they get cold lunch, 2 ham sandwiches and water in a bag.
yeah,
So a lot of them don't go for that.
yeah.
They like that hot meal they would normally get. That was a bad day to go.
So we've learned our lessons. Monday is cold lunch Monday, and we'll probably next year make sure we take the bags on Tuesday or something. But because of that, something's going on. Now, I want you to think about your own life. Maybe you weren't a part of that whole thing, but what do you do when you pull up to the intersection and read the little cardboard signs that people are holding, saying, "I'm just looking for prayers," which I think translates to a different message in reality. But what do you do when you see that little cardboard sign? Now, the city is doing its best to discourage this approach to asking for help. I mean, the city really would prefer we not have people standing in the middle of the road asking for financial assistance. And so I'm not encouraging you to give in that scenario or in that shape. As a church, we found a different way to give. We help organizations that help people all the time, that keep them out of the middle of the road, hopefully, out of traffic like that. But I would ask you to take a closer look this week when you drive by those folks that are in the middle of the intersection, because if they're locals, you're going to probably notice that there's a common theme popping up. A lot of them have gift bags. Have you seen that? I know some of you have seen it because some of you have handed them out. So because not very many people showed up for Cold Lunch Monday, the ladies in that group have all these bags in their cars, and when they see some of these folks that need it, they just pass these bags out. Now, again, I'm not endorsing this idea, because if one of you get has something happen at an intersection while you're trying to hand out one of those bags. I'm not sure that's the best way for us to distribute, and that's probably not what you're doing. But my point is, you guys are doing something. You're seeing people and their need, and that's a big part of it, is just seeing the need of the people around us. And I understand that not all of those situations are legit. But if you open your eyes, there's a lot of people with need around us. Not all of them are standing in the intersections, standing in traffic. Matter of fact, some of the most severe needs you probably have a hard time finding, honestly. I think about this gal from our last church, Lori. Lori and her husband lived in kind of a makeshift trailer home that Richie was trying to restore and make livable for them and their three boys and their little girl. And he did maintenance for the state college, had a moderate wage. She stayed home most of the time trying to take care of their kids. Her kids had significant needs. But here's the thing about Lori. She was always on Facebook or always at the thrift stores collecting stuff. And I finally asked her one day, I said, Lori, what do you do with all this stuff that you collect? And she said, well, honestly, I've been taking it to Sunday school. And she helped teach one of our Sunday school classes with little kids in it. She said, we've been putting together little takeaway bags for the homeless people that come through our community. We didn't have near as many homeless people. Something about 20 below zero in the wintertime tends to weed out the homeless population one way or another in a community. But during the summer, we had all kinds of people passing through and people with needs. But Lori, who had no resources of her own, found a way to take stuff that people didn't need anymore, didn't want anymore, and kind of collect it, even though she didn't have space for it. And she found a way to see the people in their need and help with it. And I think she was a great example of this question that we talked about last week. Do you remember last week we talked about these 4 old initials, and I asked you to add 4 new initials to it? Remember back in the days of Charles Sheldon, in his steps, he taught us to ask this question: what would Jesus do? And then I asked you to add 4 new words to that. If he were me. What would Jesus do if he were me? Well, that's what Lori, that's her interpretation of what Jesus do if he were me. And these gift bags are the women's Bible study. It's their interpretation of what would Jesus do if he were me, as is the Christmas giving and some of the other things that we do. I'm amazed that for such a small church, just what kind of an impact this body has had on the community around it. This week, when Donald's brother called and said, hey, we have some furniture that we thought maybe the church could use, I thought, I don't know what of this lady's furniture we're going to be able to use. And then I started thinking, but I wonder if Alexia, whom we set up with an apartment, or her sister, whom we set up with an apartment, or Princess, who we set up with an apartment, I wonder what some of these other families might need. We have a woman probably moving out of a shelter, don't know where she's going to go. But the Lord has opened our eyes to a lot of the needs around us. And I'll be honest, one of the most challenging things is in a church this size, figuring out how to help in those situations, or if to help at times. We also have been going through our finances. This week, Debbie and Tolly and I met and just kind of went through a review of last year's finances. And there was one area that continues to just blow the other areas of the budget clear out of the water. As far as there's one area that we tend to overspend in over every other area. And I don't necessarily mean it's the area that we spend the most money in, but it's the area that percentage-wise, beyond what we plan to give, we do more benevolence help than we ever planned to do. And some of that is awesome. Like, some of it is not even money that we would have otherwise. Like, we have people that have given us money for the purpose of helping the people in our community because they see there's a need and they want to see those needs met through the church. But not every need is financial, not even the most important ones. Today, we look at a story, Luke chapter 19, that really is about a guy who had no financial issues. If he had any financial issues, he had too much money. And some of you are like, I'll take that problem. I want that one. I don't know if you do. This one was plaguing Zacchaeus. And I want to take just a moment and actually read this story. Eli read Luke chapter 4 for us. I want to read Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. And I know you've read this story before. I've read it before. Try and read it again with new eyes and take a fresh perspective on this story. Starts at verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. Luke took note of those details for a reason. This guy was large and in charge. To the outside world, it looked like this guy needed nothing, but had everything. Verse 3, he wanted to see who Jesus was. But being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And I think that's the part of the story most of us remember when we think about Zacchaeus was a wee little man. A wee little man was he, right? You know the next verse. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. But I think sometimes we get so caught up in the fact that he was a wee little man that we overlook the fact that he is exactly like most of us. He had a great need to see Jesus despite everything else that he had. Verse 5, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, notice which happened first. He didn't just speak in general to the crowd. He saw Zacchaeus. He looked for Zacchaeus. Another word that Jesus would use to describe his mission, he sought out Zacchaeus. He was seeking lost little Zacchaeus. He looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. And this version of the NIV puts it this way, I must stay at your house today. Which is kind of interesting because when they translated this version of it, it almost sounds like Zacchaeus was the one that had what Jesus needed. I must stay at your house today, but I don't think Jesus needed to stay there because he didn't have a place to lay his head, which he didn't. But I don't think that's why he had to go to Zach's. He chose to go to Zacchaeus' house. He knew there was a need at Zacchaeus'. See, Luke 19 gives us a vivid picture of what happens when someone encounters Jesus. Jesus sees them and Jesus speaks to their greatest need. Zacchaeus, a wealthy but despised tax collector, climbs a tree just to catch a glimpse of Jesus. And when Jesus calls him by name, he says, I must stay at your house today. And Zacchaeus' life is forever changed. But that's not the end of the story. Verse 6. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. It's a little confusing because there's two pronouns there that don't quite match. Who is he and him? Zacchaeus came down and welcomed Jesus. All the people, verse 7, saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. That's how Zacchaeus was known. And honestly, in a small community like Jesus' hometown, everybody knows where the money is. Everybody's looked at that guy's house and thought, well, that's quite the place there. And in their mind, they think, what did they do to get there? And in Zacchaeus' case, clearly he had. He had the freedom as a tax collector. And what he did was perfectly legal, if completely immoral. He didn't have to do anything illegal to lay claim to people's resources, because back then you had the tax you owed the governor, but you also had the freedom as a tax collector to name your price and your fee. So you could just go to somebody's house and say, this is what you owe Rome and this is what you owe me. But you didn't do it that way. You just went and said, this is what you will pay for taxes. So I think a lot of people probably looked at Zacchaeus' house and said, that's the house I helped build. There's a lot of my resources that went into Zach's fence and his wall and his place. I wonder what Jesus is going to do there. But Zacchaeus, verse 8, stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. Let's just stop there for a moment. Can you imagine? Like, I get overwhelmed when I see the work that some of you do for others, for those in need, for the poor, and maybe sometimes not even for the poor. But I get overwhelmed. I'm like, that is incredible generosity. But I've yet to see anybody say, okay, half of everything I have, I'm going to invest in the poor now. I have 2 beds, they get 1. I have 2 houses, they get 1. I have, that's a pretty remarkable change in and of itself, isn't it? His immediate response is, I'm invested in the mission to help the marginalized, and I'm all in. They can have, I'm going to treat them like I treat myself. They get half, I keep half. Maybe that's the way he did taxes to begin with. Half to the government, half to me. Because obviously he had cheated some people. In the next verse, it talks about that. He deals with that. He goes on to say, I lost my place. The second half of verse 8. I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. So how does that work? Like in his mind, he's out there doing the math saying, okay, I've given up half, and of the remaining half, I'm going to take and repay all of the bad that I've done, everything that I've done, corrected, incorrectly collected or overcharged people. I'm going to give them 4 times that amount. How does that math work out? Because isn't that where most of those resources came from? I don't know how the math works out. I just know that the heart it reflects is incredibly generous. And when Jesus speaks and changes a person's life, he changes their heart, they respond with radical generosity. Jesus responds with radical generosity as well. In verse 9, it says, Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save what was lost. Now, I'm not going to go into what it meant that Zacchaeus was a son of Abraham. I just want to focus on this idea that Jesus met Zacchaeus and his heart was changed. Zacchaeus was seen and spoken to, and he responded. The bottom line is this story reminds us that Jesus doesn't just see who we are, he sees who we can become. His love transforms Zacchaeus from a taker to a giver, from a man defined by greed to a man defined by grace, from a killjoy, oh, the tax man's coming, oh, run, to a thrill boy. Hey, Zacchaeus is handing out. He's rewarding people. He's restoring people. He's making people whole again. So here's the practical application for this one for us. Zacchaeus knew immediately what needed changed in his life. But what about you? What needs transformed in your life? I'm not suggesting that everybody here needs to give away half of everything they have and pay back 4 times what they've wronged people with, although I imagine most of you wouldn't have to pay back much because I've been around you. That 4-fold time, I can't imagine there are too many people that you owe a great deal. But I want you to think about Zacchaeus. When he responds to the gospel and the generosity of God in the gospel of Jesus, he becomes incredibly generous. It's immediate and it's appropriate, like he responds the way that he's been treated. Now imagine the folks that he pays back 4-fold. That is life-changing for those folks, right? If you've been wrong, just think about it for a moment. Like, if the IRS were to restore to you half of what you've sent into them over the last 10 years, and you got that in one big lump check, what would that do to you? Now let's take that a little step farther. Let's say that they had an error in this area, and maybe there had been a tax person in the area that had overcharged all of us for a period of time. And all of a sudden those people put the money back in. For example, did you know this? If you're a business owner that has received payment via Visa over the last, I think it's like 10 or 15 years, I don't remember exactly what the dates are. But during that time, there's been a fee that you've been paying in as a business owner. We pay that fee. They usually pass it along to us. But the businesses have been receiving, these bills, and they pay these fees. The fees that they take from us, they pass along to them. Well, the courts have now ruled that those businesses were overcharged for those fees. And so now all those businesses are able to take and turn back in those transactions, send it in for the settlement. I think the attorneys will keep most of the money, but there will be money that will come back to those businesses because there's a penalty to be paid. Well, imagine what that does to the businesses. It gives them resources they haven't had for a while. Imagine this community that Zacchaeus is in. All of a sudden, instead of one guy on the hill having all the money, he's restored and made people whole again. He's literally, set free those that have been oppressed. Can you imagine the conversations in the community? See, a lot of people think about the early church and they think, how is it that the early church grew from 0 to 3,000 to 10,000 to devouring the planet so quickly? Well, when you think about people like Zacchaeus and the impact their repentance and restitution had on the culture around them, it makes sense pretty quickly, right? If this became the norm in the church, don't you think that would catch people's attention? There's a tendency in churches, and my brother's church took part in this a couple of years ago. There's a ministry that has gone out, and they have taken on the role to help people settle their medical debts, long-term medical debts, okay? And they've negotiated. Like if you've ever had long-term medical debt, you've got $100,000. You go to the hospital a lot of times and you try and get them to write some of it off. Then you turn into your insurance company first, and then the remainder you try and get some of it written off. And those people will often not write that off, but they'll carry that debt for a long time on their books. The hospitals and the medical community will carry that debt and eventually turn it over to a collection company. And how much of that money is that hospital hoping to collect from the collection company? Roughly 10%, something like that. It's a minimal amount that they're hoping. So somebody got this idea and said, well, what if we went and negotiated? Instead of this hitting the collection companies, what if we could negotiate more of that debt for them, say like 25%? Wouldn't a hospital or a medical, wouldn't they rather have 25% than 10%? If you're not a math major, just say yes. They would rather have 25% than 10%. And so then they went out and they came up with a plan, and they approached churches and other communities and businesses and said, we want to wipe out, for example, if somebody did this in Beaumont, which I don't know if anybody's doing this. I don't know that it's something we have the resources to do. But in Omaha, my brother's church did this. They took on the medical debt for 5 counties in their area. And they negotiated this business negotiated it down to a smaller percentage. And as a church, they paid off. And I don't know, somewhere like $100,000 worth of, is like what it cost the church. But that paid back, and freed all kinds of families from their debt in their area. Can you imagine, like if you had a debt like that and you found out it was paid by a church, how would you feel about that? How would you respond to that? Like you'd want to know what's going on at that place. What is going on there? Now, this is not me saying, hey, this is our new strategy. We're going to pay off the entire debt for the community, medical debt for the community. But I want you to understand that when God changes your heart, he opens up pathways for change in the community as well. That our transformation transforms the place around us. Well, back onto the story. The simple point for this story of Zacchaeus that I want us to draw from this, yes, he was a wee little man. Yes, he offered great hospitality to Jesus. And yes, Jesus brought salvation to his house and his household and to his community. But I want us to grab onto this. When we begin to live like Jesus, it impacts the people around us significantly. Maybe it's in our relationships, our priorities. Maybe it's generosity, like in his case. I like what Jenny Allen said about this. I guess I didn't put this one on the screen, but she said this: we don't drift into holiness. We must fight for it. It is a part of that daily battle. It is a part of that life change. It's about grabbing on and saying, Lord Jesus, my thing isn't that I've stolen from the community, but this is my thing. Now, what do you want me to do with it? This is my sin, and you've forgiven it, but is there anything I can do to restore it? I think we have to get in that closet and come before the Lord and say, what steps can I take to align my life with Jesus' example, to be more like him? And perhaps it's committing to a lifestyle of generosity. Perhaps it's about forgiving people who have wronged us. We're seeking reconciliation with people that really we don't want to be around. I don't know what that is for you. But here's what I do know, that when we come to Jesus, we begin to align our life with him, and we talk about that here as living and loving like Jesus. And these two passages call us to not only admire Jesus, but to follow him. His mission was to welcome the outsider, prioritize people over power, and love sacrificially. And as his disciples, we're called to do the same. Consider how Jesus invites Zacchaeus into this relationship, despite his reputation. He is a crowd around him, and he selects probably the least popular guy in the crowd at the moment. And he says, Zach, you and I, we have something to talk about. I need to go to your house. And in doing this, he models what it looks like to love without condition. John Mark Comer puts it this way: the way of Jesus is not just about right beliefs, but about right living, practicing his way in everyday life. So how can the church embody this? Well, I want to talk about it from three standpoints today: the head, the heart, and the hands. Our head, our understanding. I think when we come to Jesus, it changes the way that we understand life and our outlook on things around us. Jesus' mission in Luke 4 outlines this idea that he came to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom to the oppressed, and healing for the brokenhearted. Our mission should reflect that. We should understand that, and I think this church knows that. We've thought a lot about that and talked about that, but how do we see these themes played out in Southeast Texas today, and what does it mean for us as believers to embody this mission? I want to actually bring that question to you instead of just to me. How do you see these themes, these three: good news to the poor, freedom for the oppressed, and healing for the brokenhearted? How does that play out in our community? Do you see the church rallying around those three actions in this community? How do we proclaim good news to the poor, freedom to the oppressed, and healing for the brokenhearted? Anybody? Can you think of examples of how the church in this community is doing that? Christmas was a great time. Don't you think at Christmas we do a pretty good job of proclaiming good news to the poor? But we also have this coalition. They just met this last week. The mayor has a homeless coalition, that groups of people, largely from churches and a few other agencies, that come together and say, how can we help these people? Right? There's one example. Do you know of some that I don't know of, maybe? How is the church proclaiming good news to the poor in our community? The work that we do at some other place, absolutely. Which is basically the reason it came along. If you don't know about some other place, that used to be that before some other place existed, that's an actual organization. People would knock on the doors at the church and say, hey, I can't pay my rent this month. Can you help me out? Or, we don't have any food, we don't have a place to stay. Can you help me out? And churches would run out of resources quickly. Can I just point out that that's one sign that the church is doing some of this, because we're known for it. The first year I was here, about the only people that I saw during the week at the church were the kind of every other day somebody would knock on the door looking for gas money. The most common theme was, I was on my way back. We went over to the casino in Louisiana, and we're on our way back to Houston, and we ran out of gas. And I'm like, we're not even on that route, but we're getting that call. Somehow we're known for that. The people that help really bad gamblers find their way home. I don't know. But in some ways, it's good that the church is known for helping the poor, right? That's why these people reach out to the church. But it can be a little overwhelming. So the idea of some other place was constantly people would knock on the church, well, you're going to have to find some other place to go to. So they just went ahead and started a place called Some Other Place. And that's where we pool up our resources and contribute and help make a difference together. How about freedom for the oppressed? How are we helping with that in our community? Can you think of anything? How do we lift up those that are beaten down? Do you remember these Connect Sundays that you used to have, where you'd have people in from different groups to connect with before taking action? Who are some of those folks? Harvest House. They have a new name now. I can't remember what the new name is, but now I know them as the organization formerly known as Harvest House. Yeah. And I think they're throwing a big thing this month, actually. And they help with,
human trafficking
yeah.
issues, and a lot of education, but they also do have like a resident
Yeah,
facility where
for trafficking victims.
literally rescued, but also a lot of what they do, they came to ATA last year and they do education so that kids can help recognize when their friends are being trafficked.
And you probably don't think that's a thing. How could I ever be going to school with a trafficking victim? I know my kids didn't think that was a thing until I met a young lady who played on the volleyball team who was a human trafficking victim. She was being held but allowed to go to school where she could make connections, and then her abuser would exploit those connections. Yeah, you wouldn't think of that, but that happens. How about healing for the brokenhearted? Is this one that's a little easier for us? How do we help provide healing for the brokenhearted around us?
Well, Elijah's Place, that's run by the Catholic Charities.
Okay,
They counsel children.
okay.
Lost loved ones.
So grief counseling for children. Yeah, very good.
And I think things like Buckner and the Boys Home
Boys
are
Home,
those things
yes.
that those have been, could be in either of these categories.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This particular area of the country is really sensitive to disaster relief efforts.
There is an oppression that happens with the disaster, isn't there?
Costs of helping kids with broken homes.
I didn't hear the first part.
Also,
CASA, yeah. Being an advocate, a court-appointed advocate. Yeah.
There's also another one, but I can't remember the name. It's behind what used to be Red Lobster. It's on that road.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Yeah, they help children.
Well, let me ask you this. Of these three things, good news to the poor, freedom for the oppressed, healing for the brokenhearted, the church in general, which of those are we best at? And I don't mean just our location, but I mean the church in general. Are we better at providing good news to the poor, freedom for the oppressed, or healing for the brokenhearted?
The poor, like you say, people go door knocking to churches.
Yeah?
When they have a bill to be paid, they go door knocking.
The poor know where they can turn, is what you're saying. Okay? Good. Which of these do we need to work on more, do you think, locally, like right here, of these three? Good news to the poor, freedom for the oppressed, or healing for the brokenhearted? Which of those should Christ's covenant maybe be thinking more about?
Well, if you help either of the second two, aren't you also
Yeah, there is kind of a holistic, I mean, it all flows together and helps, yeah. Because to be poor is not just to be financially drained, but it could be poor from oppression, right? Or because you were broken, yeah. I would encourage us to keep in mind one thing this week. There's a national holiday, right? Is that next week? Not this week, but next week. So this week, have you made plans for the national holiday next week? Could you think of something that you could focus on in one of these three areas? Like that holiday is a great time to highlight, MLK, Martin Luther King, was known for those three areas, right? He invested his life in those three things. What could we do to honor that legacy, to pass that along? Because really it was out of his faith and his personal experience that he did that. And I will be the first to admit, I don't know near enough about his legacy. I just know that someday I want to be known for something, and I'd much rather it be something like that than what I've got going so far, right? Zacchaeus gets known for this amazing change, not just because he changes the way he thinks about himself, but because he also has a change in his attitude. He has a change of heart. So let's talk about the heart. Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus led to deep repentance that then moved towards radical generosity. When you reflect on your own life, what areas do you feel God is calling you to surrender or transform? Like what work is he doing in your heart? This isn't one that we're probably going to talk about out loud. But it is one I'd like you to be thinking about this week is just, Lord, do a work in my heart. Because here's what happens. Sometimes when we get so involved in sin and we just keep doing it over and over again, we keep overcharging on that guy's taxes because the last person didn't notice, so we charge more next time. I don't know what it was like for Zacchaeus, but I bet it was something like that. You just get into this routine and it spreads. And that impact gets bigger and bigger. And Zacchaeus' heart was such that he was looking for something the day he went and found Jesus and the day Jesus found him. What about us? Are we looking for anything? Is there anything in your heart that is out of alignment with the heart of Jesus? I think that's this week a prayer action. Now let's do a call to action, our hands. Maybe a change in our head will stop at a change in our heart, but I think for most of us it moves to, Lord, what do you want me to do about this? It calls our hands into action. In light of Jesus' example, what's one specific action you can take this week to reach out to the marginalized? You can break into Teresa's car and borrow half of the bag she still has in her back seat and take them to homeless people. But is there more? And how can you ensure that it's not just a one-time thing, but it's part of a lifestyle of love and mission? Would you pray with me? Lord, thank you for your example of Jesus who proclaimed freedom to the oppressed and brought transformation to broken lives. Lord, empower us by your Spirit to live missionally, love sacrificially, and serve faithfully like Jesus. In his name we live and love. Amen.